here we have what you see here. Again, imagine you're a Jew in Los Angeles and you're walking downtown in the 1935, 1936, and you see Nazi swastika flags flying from stores very proudly. Well, the story I want to tell begins in July 1933, when Nazis in Los Angeles hold their first open meeting, and they hold it under the name the Friends of New Germany. And at that meeting, which was held at the Alt-Heidelberg Inn, just on the outskirts of downtown, Nazis had several hundred people show up, and they announced that their goal was to save America from their two greatest threats, communists and Jews, which, as far as they were concerned, were one and the same. And at the end of the meeting, reporters who had gone to cover it, one reporter went up and asked 5 of the brown shirts to give the Hitler salute, and they did. And the next morning, this picture appeared in the front page of most of Los Angeles newspapers. And an article accompanying it is here, all in yellow, that you can see. And mainly it talked about how they had held their first meeting, it was enthusiastic, and how at the end, a few hundred people signed up to become members of the Friends of New Germany. Well, many of the people who looked at this picture probably thought of these men either as Nazi thugs or as Keystone cops, except for one man, Leon Lewis, who was particularly concerned with the last paragraph here that most people probably never even read closely, which said, "The Friends of New Germany are inviting any World War I veteran, be it German or American, who finds themselves without a home, without food, without clothing, to come, and they can have free place to stay, eat, live, shower in the basement of the Alt-Heidelberg Inn. And the only thing they need to do in return is listen to the Minister of Propaganda, Hans Winterhalter, talk about Hitler and the New Germany and the wonderful things he was doing." Well, one person understood that this was not simply an offer based on generosity. It was an attempt to build a brown shirt movement in Los Angeles in the same way Hitler had built his brown shirt movement in Munich in the 1920s. And that man who's the hero of my book is Leon Lewis. Well, who was Leon Lewis? He was born to German Jewish emigres who had moved to Wisconsin, and Leon was born in the late 1880s. He went to college at George Washington University in DC, and then went to law school at the University of Chicago. And he graduated law school in 1913. But instead of taking a job with a firm, he was devoted to the Hebrew concept of Tikkun Olam, healing the world. And he decided to join a brand new organization that had just been founded that year called the Anti-Defamation League. And he was one of the 3 founders of the ADL. He was the initial national executive secretary, and his job was to monitor anti-Semitism across the country. 2 years later, in 1915, he was given a second task, which is to monitor motion pictures in Hollywood to make sure that no anti-Semitic images were coming out of there. And so he was working closely with the moguls from 1915 on. Well, when America entered World War I in April 1917, Lewis decided to enlist, but he did not want to go in as an officer. He went in as a private. But sometimes you can't hide your abilities, even in the Army. And he wound up a major by the time he left. And he had seen combat, he had been gassed, and he had stayed in Europe after the war ended to help with the distribution of food and aid. And when he returned, he told his 2 bosses at the ADL that anti-Semitism in Europe is going to really expand after World War I, and we need to monitor that. And if any of you have been in organizations where you've had a really good idea of a new committee that needs to be formed, well, when you bring it up, you're usually the one put in charge. And that's exactly what happened. Leon Lewis then became the international executive secretary of the ADL, as well as the national executive secretary, which meant he was now monitoring anti-Semitism abroad. which in turn meant that there was probably no American following Hitler's rise to power more closely than Leon Lewis. Well, in around 1930-31, because of health reasons, he moved to Los Angeles. And he observed changes in the city, and particularly in the spring of 1933, Adolf Hitler sent his former commanding officer in World War I, Captain Robert Pape, to Los Angeles with the task of organizing Friends of New Germany outlets all along the Pacific coast, in turn preparing for Der Tag, the day that Nazis would ultimately rise up and take over the American government. Pape, in turn, was assisted by Hermann Schwinn, who was his secretary initially and then replaced him when people felt that he hadn't been militant enough. And we see him outside the Aryan bookstore, which sold all Nazi literature, the latest Nazi newspapers, magazines, and you can see here, it was also attacked by people on the left, and they simply put the Red Terrors here. Could be Jews who had done it, who knows, or just ordinary Americans who hated seeing swastikas in their midst. The other two leaders of the Friends of New Germany were Hans Winterhalter, who was the Minister of Propaganda, and Paul Themlitz, who both owned the Aryan bookstore and was the #2 Nazi in the city. Well, Leon Lewis, after he read the article about Nazis offering a place to stay, he grew incredibly worried. Why did he grow worried? Because he realized there was no unified opposition, either locally or nationally, to the rise of Nazism. Now, when I first started working on this book, I had bought into the question that historians had been asking for years, which is why didn't Jews, both abroad and particularly Jews in America, protest more against Hitler's rise to power? And what I discovered is they did protest. In fact, there was quite a bit of protest. The problem is the Jews could not agree on a single strategy. And to talk about strategies that were not united is not the same as no strategy at all. So you had the American Jewish Congress being led by Rabbi Stephen Wise, who took a very militant position, arguing that American Jews should get in Hitler's face and force him to back down. And he worked with the Anti-Nazi League to create an international boycott of all German products until Hitler's regime stopped persecuting all minorities, not just Jews, but all minorities. At the other end of the Jewish strategy was the American Jewish Committee, led by Judge Proskauer, who said, if you get in Hitler's face, he's just going to double down on the Jews and make it worse. That the most effective strategy was to contact religious leaders in Germany and have them pressure Hitler quietly. Well, while this debate was going on, Leon Lewis was watching it. He had been, even though he could no longer work full-time in Chicago, where he had been based, he was considered so valuable that his bosses at the ADL made him the first regional representative. So he became the Southern California representative of the ADL. And also he remained their chief liaison with the motion picture industry. Well, Lewis was willing to wait and see what would happen with, could the Jews unite in a single strategy? After all, he's a lawyer. You know, he's not leading a national movement or local, he's just a lawyer. But after the Friends of New Germany held their open meeting in July 1933, he said, I need to act because if we don't do something, they're just going to grow more powerful. And what he decided to do was to run an undercover operation, recruiting 4 of his friends in the Disabled American Veterans Organization, who he asked to go undercover to join every Nazi and fascist group in LA and to be agent provocateurs, in that meaning to rise to positions of power and then to report to Lewis on a daily basis, letting him know what was going on when the time came, he would gather all the evidence he could, turn it over to the authorities, and allow them to run the spy operation. Well, the first person he approached was a fellow disabled American veteran, Captain John Schmidt. And John Schmidt was a German emigre whose father had been a general in the Bavarian army. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the German army. And John had been a German military cadet until the age of 16, when he left Germany, came to the US, enrolled or enlisted in the US Army, lied about his age, enlisted in the US Army and fought with General Pershing in Mexico, and then fought with the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe against his own family and relatives. And he was considered a coup because the Nazis knew who his father was, knew who his brother was, and they thought, oh my God, we're going to get a German officer here. Because what the Nazis, these were no fools. These were not Keystone cops. These were very smart men. And what they understood was, A, Southern California was the largest repository of World War I veterans in the United States. There were over 150,000 of them in Southern California. Also, Los Angeles, German Americans were the largest ethnic group by far, more than double of any other ethnic group. And the Nazis knew if they were going to try to build an army here, an army based around patriotism of fighting the communist Jewish threat, then they needed leaders who men would follow. And they knew that no American was going to follow a German officer, and no German was going to follow an American officer. And so Leon Lewis recruited a variety of them. Schmidt was his probably number one recruit because of his fame. And also he recruited his wife, Alice, who became the head of the women's auxiliary unit of the Friends of New Germany, and was brought into their inner circle, where she was asked to translate secret documents sent from Germany, which she did. And of course, immediately after she left the room, wrote out as much as she could and sent it to Leon Lewis. Well, he also recruited Captain Carl Sunderland and his wife Blanche, and Sunderland had spent most of his life in the American cavalry. And what the Nazis didn't know, they knew that his parents were German. He pretended that he didn't know German, couldn't speak it or understand it, but he could do both. And so the Nazis would speak in German in front of him, thinking he didn't understand anything. And he would then send in the reports to Leon Lewis. A third spy was Major C. Burt Allen. Everyone had a number. So he was Agent 7. And finally, the only Jewish spy he had, who he only really brought to the Germans' stronghold, Friends of New Germany headquarters once, was Colonel William Conley. And he recruited Conley for one main reason. Conley didn't look Jewish, and with a name like Conley, it didn't seem Jewish, but he was a Jew. And most importantly, he was the national commander of the disabled American veterans. And the Nazis considered that a coup. Why? Because in March 1933, when Roosevelt took over as president of the United States, he took over a bankrupt nation. And the very first thing Congress passed was the Economy Act of 1933, or 34, excuse me, which cut military benefits from a maximum of $100, $80 to $100 a month that many vets had been receiving, to a maximum of $20, and many vets had their benefits cut off completely, zero money. Conley was traveling the country, denouncing the New Deal, denouncing Roosevelt, denouncing Congress, and calling for action. And the Friends of New Germany, the local Nazis, loved that idea because they wanted somebody who was going to challenge what they called the Jew Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, it's a good thing those spies got into action, because the first three men immediately started going to Nazi headquarters on a regular basis, getting to be known, volunteering their services if any training need to be made. And in the meantime, in the course of going for lunches and dinners with Nazi leaders, they met a recent Nazi recruit, Dietrich Gefgen. Dietrich Gefgen had left Germany in the mid-20s after he shot to death 2 communist Jews and didn't want to stand trial for murder. So he fled to America, worked as a chef, made his way cross country till he reached San Francisco sometime in the early 30s. And while he was in San Francisco, he joined the National Guard. And as a member of the National Guard, he had access to their facilities, and he started drawing up blueprints. And he drew up a set of blueprints of everything inside the National Guard armory, where all the heavy weapons were kept, where all the ammunition was kept, where the officers' quarters were, and where the enlisted men's quarters were. He then went down to San Diego and did the same thing there, working with local Nazis and silver shirts, who were the American Nazis, who the day after Hitler was named Reich Chancellor of Germany, William Dudley Pelley, who had been a very successful screenwriter and short story writer, said if a painter can become Reich Chancellor of Germany, then I can set up my own group in America. And while Hitler has the brown shirts and Mussolini has the black shirts, I'm going to set up the silver shirts, fascists dedicated to saving America from Jews and communists. And the main difference between the silver shirts and the Friends of New Germany, where the silver shirts were almost all American, the Friends of New Germany were almost all Germans. Well, Gefgen, as he got to know the 3 spies, he began to tell them of his grand plot to set off a revolution in America. And he asked them to get the blueprints for the LA Armory and to get him machine guns. And when they asked him in turn, why did he need that? He said, here's my plan. I already have the blueprints for San Francisco and San Diego. Once I get the blueprints for LA, on the appointed day, there's going to be a coordinated attack on all 3 armories. We're going to have Nazis, silver shirts, and every German boat that docks along the Pacific or Atlantic coast has a small contingent of Gestapo troops on it. We're going to have Gestapo troops in San Francisco, LA, and San Diego disembarking and meeting us at the same moment, same minute, same hour, same day. We're going to burst into the armories fully armed, and we're going to capture all the men and offer them the following choice. Do you want to join us in saving America from the communist Jewish threat or not? Everyone who joined them was going to be welcomed into their new patriotic army. Everyone who refused would be murdered on the spot. Well, this was a threat that they couldn't avoid. They had to take seriously. After all, Gefgen had already murdered someone. Why wouldn't he murder more people? Well, in fact, in the very last meeting, because Leon Lewis was a lawyer, he knew he needed evidence that he could admit in the court. So he, in fact, lured Gefgen into a hotel room so no one would see them. At least the 3 men told Gefgen that. But he had set up a dictaphone machine in the room and recorded everything that was said. The whole plot was on record. Now, while this wouldn't be legally admissible, it was damning evidence. At that point, Leon Lewis said, great, now I can go to the authorities. Leon Lewis never expected to maintain a spy operation. He said, I'm a lawyer. What do I know about that kind of stuff? And instead, his idea was, I'll gather enough information. He had all his reports, he had documents, that I'll bring it to the authorities. They will take over the undercover operation, and they'll put down the Nazis. Well, the first person he went to see was the police chief of Los Angeles, James Two Gun Davis. And I've put his favorite photograph of himself here, where he's got pistols in both hands. He won the National Police Pistol Shooting Contest several years in a row. He won both shooting left-handed and shooting right-handed. He was ambidextrous. And it was, if you don't remember anything in the talk today, the one thing you're going to remember is it was the police chief Davis who coined the expression, shoot first, ask questions later. Well, Lewis walked into Davis's office expecting that he would well, let me go back one, expecting that he would meet with some kind of enthusiasm. And instead, 2 minutes after his initial session, and I know this because as soon as he left the chief's office, he wrote a memo. And when I opened the box for the memo, I could almost feel the heat of his anger coming out. He said, 2 minutes into my conversation with the police chief, he stopped me and said, "You don't get it. Hitler's only doing what he needs to do to save Germany from the Jewish problem. And that in LA, the real threat to our citizens are not the Nazis and fascists, but it's all those communists living in Boyle Heights, which was the Jewish neighborhood." And he said, "There's nothing I can do," and he threw him out of his office. Well, Leon Lewis then went to see the sheriff, Eugene Biscaluz, and discovered here was a photograph of Biscaluz signed by the Nazi council to Los Angeles, who was his good friend, and they would often have Sunday brunch together. Biscaluz also said, "There's nothing I can do," and threw him out. And at that point, Lewis went to the FBI. And unlike the police chief or sheriff, the local FBI agents were very sympathetic to what he said. But they said, "There's nothing we can do. We can't run any undercover operation without the express authorization of J. Edgar Hoover." And Hoover refused to give it. They asked him over the years, and he repeatedly refused, because as far as Hoover was concerned, he wanted all his men tailing alleged communists, not fascists and Nazis, who he believed were far more patriotic. And at that point, Leon Lewis realized, I have no choice. I have to keep running this operation on my own. The problem is, by November and December of 1933, he had spent so much time running the undercover operation, he had lost all his clients. And he wrote a memo that December saying, "Unless I can get outside funding, I'm going to have to shut this down. I have no clients. I have a wife and 2 small children. I've almost spent all my savings, and I can't keep doing this." Well, at that point, he went to the 3 most powerful Jewish leaders in Los Angeles. Irving Thalberg, who is the number 2 person at MGM, known as the Boy Wonder, who was to this day considered, he, not Louis B. Mayer, was the creative genius behind MGM's success. But Thalberg was also the most successful Jewish fundraiser in Los Angeles. He raised more money for Jewish causes than any other man. And then he talked to the other 2 Jewish leaders, Edgar Magnin, who is the rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, the most powerful temple both in Los Angeles and probably the most powerful Reform congregation on the West Coast. And finally, he talked to Mendel Silberberg, the most powerful and important of all of them. And many of you may remember the name Lew Wasserman. Imagine Lew Wasserman on steroids. This guy made Lew Wasserman look like an intern. Mendel Silberberg was really the first entertainment lawyer in America. He represented all the Jewish moguls. He represented most of the studios, and he represented most of the Jewish actors and actresses in Los Angeles. And as one of his then young lawyers told me, who was in his 80s by the time I interviewed him, he said, "Mendel was very soft-spoken, but when he told you to do something, you didn't ask why, you just did it." And after Lewis explained what happened, Mendel Silberberg called up 40, said, "Don't worry, keep the operation going. We will find you the money." He called 40 of the most powerful studio heads and producers, all men, and told them to show up at the Hillcrest Country Club, which was the Jewish country club in LA, in March without telling anyone. This was a secret meeting. And on a night on March 1934, it was a red carpet evening without the red carpet. 40 of the most powerful men in Hollywood show up at the country club, and they're all escorted into a private dining room. And in front of every seat are copies of the Silver Ranger magazine, which was the Silver Shirts publication. And as they leaf through, they see there are more articles condemning the Jews in Hollywood than anything else. And they see things like this here, which is the boy calling for boycotts of Hollywood, boycott the movies. Hollywood is the Sodom and Gomorrah where international Jewry controls vice, dope, gambling. And then something like this was turned into a sticker, and the Nazis plastered buildings and telephone poles all around the city with this sticker. Well, Leon Lewis had dealt with these men since 1915. And when he went into the meeting in 1934, he knew they weren't going to just fund him because he was a fellow Jew. They were concerned about what was going on, and Lewis went in there knowing the only way he was going to get money was to frighten them into generosity, and that's exactly what he did. He started off by telling them about his spy operation and telling them that his men had also infiltrated the studios to see what was going on. And what they discovered was their studio foremen were dismissing every Jewish employee, blue-collar worker in the studios. He went around the room, Louis B. Mayer, MGM, you got only one Jew left on your lot. Harry Cohn, Columbia, there are none left there. Paramount, you got one Jew left. And he went around the room talking about the systematic firing of Jews that none of them were aware of, because all the moguls were really concerned with what we call the above the line personnel, the names that appear at the beginning of the movie, the actors, the directors, the writers. But he saved his most potent warning to the end, which is, my spies have also uncovered hit lists, and your names are on those lists. At the end of the evening, he walked out with the equivalent of $400,000 in 2021 dollars to fund his spy operation, and a pledge to keep funding it until Nazis were no longer a threat. And it's a good thing they did fund it, because over the next 12 years, Leon Lewis uncovered, and his agents, plots to send cars through Goyle Heights, the Jewish neighborhood, with machine guns, killing as many Jews as possible, to create phony fumigation companies that once they hit a Jewish home would pump in cyanide. But also they uncovered plans to blow up military installations all along the Pacific coast and to sabotage the aircraft factory industry in LA. And LA was the largest producer of aircraft in the country. But what I want to do in the remaining time is tell you two of the plots they uncovered. One of his two most powerful and important agents was Chuck Slocum, Agent C-19. Slocum was a Christian, born in Oakland, raised in Long Beach. In the early 1930s, he joined the Ku Klux Klan in Long Beach because he was an ardent anti-communist, and the Klan was the most powerful anti-communist group there was. But in a short amount of time, he realized the Klan didn't just hate communists, they hated Jews, they hated Catholics, they hated Blacks. He didn't hate any of them. And so he wound up offering his services to Leon Lewis, remaining in the Klan, but going undercover for Lewis and becoming the Klan's representative to the Nazis. And he became his most important undercover agent. And over the course of time, he discovered two unbelievable plots of mass murder. The first was September 1935, when on a Sunday morning, Los Angelinos opened up their LA Times, and out came of every single Times this proclamation that had been put into the newspapers in the early morning, that Saturday night, Sunday morning. A man, Ingram Hughes, a former linotype operator and failed attorney, went to the Times and had his friends along with him put these proclamations in. And without reading this, there's only one line that is very important. Again, 1935, he said, I call on all God-fearing Christians to join me in enacting a solution to the Jewish problem that cannot be done by legislation. And his solution was he and Slocum and a few allies were going to kidnap 20 of the main leaders, Jewish leaders of LA, bankers, lawyers, and one movie person, Busby Berkeley, the director. They were going to bring them out to a isolated park. They were going to hang them from trees, all 20 of them. And while they were dangling from the ropes, they would bring machine guns with them and fire so much lead into the body that hopefully they could separate the trunk from the top of the body, and the trunk would fall to the ground. They would then call newspapers and say, come to this park at dawn. There'll be something there, and send photographers. And the idea was those photographers would show up. You would see 20 Jews dangling from a rope. And he said, when this reaches the national press, they're going to be bloodbaths throughout America, because they're going to realize, all the patriots are going to realize, those Jews aren't as powerful as we think. They can be killed and we can do it. Well, what stopped Ingram Hughes from proceeding was Chuck Slocum saying, look, we know that Leon Lewis is running an undercover operation. How did they know? Because the police, that wasn't just Police Chief Davis, who was an anti-Semite. He had a captain, William Hines, who ran the, quote, Red Squad. And Hines was a frequent guest at Nazi headquarters, and he would trade information with them. They would give him information about communist activities, and he would give them information about Jewish activities. And he told them Leon Lewis was spying on them, but he never told them who the spies were. So they knew Lewis had a spy operation going. And Slocum said, look, if we commit these murders, Lewis has a spy inside. We don't know who the spy is. We're going to wind up in prison for the rest of our lives. So let's postpone it until we figure out who the spy is. Well, they never did, obviously, and the plot never happened. But a second plot that I think came closer to being realized, had it not been for Leon Lewis, occurred 2 years later in the fall of 1937 at a German Day celebration in Hindenburg Park, 17 miles northeast of LA. A man who you see here, Captain Leopold McLaughlin, who's kind of scrunched down because Captain McLaughlin is somewhere between 6'6" and 6'8". He came to Los Angeles in 1937 after completing a world tour in which he had been teaching jujitsu to police groups, authorities all around the world. He was the world's jiu-jitsu champion. He was teaching jiu-jitsu to the Scotland Yard, to the French Sûreté, and then he came to LA to teach jiu-jitsu. But on top of that, he was an anti-Semite, a virulent anti-Semite who wanted to kill Jews. Now, this is a man to be afraid of. Why? He fought in the Boer War. He fought in World War I, and he had published 4 books on how to kill in hand-to-hand combat. And at the park that day, he ran into 3 men who would engage in a new conspiracy. Chuck Slocum, Kenneth Alexander, who was the Los Angeles head of the Silver Shirts, and Henry Allen, who was the most prominent fascist in the city. He was probably the leading male fascist. His wife was the head of the Italian fascists, and his son had been thrown out of middle school for trying to organize the junior Silver Shirt unit in his junior high. Well, the idea this time was going to be not to kidnap, but to plant bombs at 24 homes of Hollywood figures, 22 Jews and 2 actors known to be too friendly to the Jews, Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, who many of you may not know that Cagney worked in New York, worked in Harlem when it was Jewish, and was absolutely fluent in Yiddish. Well, the 22 Jews were going to be the head of every studio, plus the major producers. And once again, the idea was, when we blow up their homes, we're going to have teams of Nazis, Silver Shirts, White Russians, and Gestapos coming off the ships. We would plant the bombs. They would be blown up at the same moment, the same night. And again, the next morning, there'll be pictures in newspapers around the world. And McLaughlin predicted this would lead to a major bloodbath It would lead to pogroms throughout America, that the Jewish menace once and for all would be confronted by patriotic citizens. Well, here's fascist Henry Allen, and Henry Allen had a device that he called his kite killer, which you can see right here. It's a plastic handle with a 2x4 piece of wood here. And one day Slocum, in one of his memos to Leon Lewis, described that Henry Allen pulled off the road while they were driving. And he said, "Let me show you how to use a kite killer." And they pulled off the side, and he had Slocum stand right opposite him. And he said, "Here's what you do. You plunge the kite killer into the stomach of the Jew as hard as you can. And when they double over in pain, you just keep hitting them on the skull with the wood until you hear the skull crack, and then leave as fast as you can." These men wanted to kill Jews. In fact, Henry Allen had even written a letter to the House Un-American Activity Committee saying he would be happy to kill Jews, even if it meant prison or his own life. Well, the place that they met, again, this is not Nazi Germany. This is a scene 17 miles northeast of downtown LA at Hindenburg Park, which is today known as La Crescenta Park. Well, Leon Lewis, after he has Slocum tell him what's going on, Lewis this time thought, this guy is much more serious and experienced killer than any plot we've ever dealt with. We can't take a chance that he might be able to carry out even one murder. And so Lewis had Slocum convince Kenneth Alexander and Henry Allen that in fact McLaughlin was setting them up, and that McLaughlin was going to turn state's evidence the moment that they killed everybody. The three of them would be sent to prison for life, and McLaughlin would leave the country because he had been given immunity. And so Slocum convinced them to go to the district attorney and turn state's evidence against McLaughlin. And they did. They went to the district attorney. They told him all about the plot. They swore out affidavits. But the only thing is, Leon Lewis didn't want the DA to prosecute McLaughlin for attempted murder, because there were part of his group were people who belonged to the county sheriff, and belonged to the LAPD. And he did not want to embarrass the police or sheriff. Instead, he thought he had some leverage, that if he didn't embarrass them, they would agree the next time he came to them with a Nazi plot, they would take him seriously. And they agreed. And so instead, McLaughlin was put on trial for extortion, because he was extorting a millionaire in Santa Barbara that he was also teaching jujitsu to. And the judge found him guilty of extortion, sentenced him to 5 years in prison, but said, "I will suspend the sentence if you take the next boat out of Los Angeles back to England." Well, in the back of the courtroom was his brother, Victor McLaughlin, who had won an Oscar for Best Actor in the film The Informer, of all things. And Victor knew that his brother was crazy. In fact, there were 6 other McLaughlin brothers in LA, and they all knew that their brother was nuts. And they went out and paid for the ticket. McLaughlin then left, and that was the end of that plot. But the last thing I want to tell before I end is what happens on Pearl Harbor. December 7th, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And the next morning, the Justice Department sends out a teletype to every FBI office in every major city. And in LA, the teletype goes out. You can get this on the FBI website. It's very impressive. It has a day-to-day, hour-by-hour summary of who's arrested each day. And in LA, the Justice Department memo has 3 lists, an A list, a B list, and a C list. And the FBI are told, work with the police and sheriff, go after the A list first, and then the B list, and then the C list. Well, it's incredibly impressive. Within 48 hours, they arrest every major Nazi and fascist in the city. There's only one question that I had, which is, how did they know who to arrest? Because when I wrote away for Herman Schwinn's Freedom of Information Act, Schwinn had been from 1934 and till 45 the head of the German-American Bund in LA, and he was the #2 Nazi in America. He was in charge of everything from the Pacific coast through Hawaii. And it was thought he would probably become the #1 Nazi after the current head resigned or left. Well, Schwinn's FBI file began in January 1942. The FBI had no records on him before then. So if the FBI had no records on the head Nazi in LA, how did they know who to arrest? Well, the answer is starting in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Leon Lewis and his assistant, Joe Roos, started compiling a list, well, very long list, not just a list, but description of every major Nazi and fascist individual and group. And it in fact went for a few hundred pages. And every year they would send this updated version to the FBI, to Army military intelligence and naval intelligence. And they kept updating it. And the last list they had sent that I had seen in Leon Lewis's records had 3 lists of the most dangerous, dangerous, and keep under surveillance. And when I read the FBI memo, or should I say the Justice Department memo, I thought, wait a minute, these lists seem awfully familiar. And I went out to the National Archives and I found, in fact, the last memo that the FBI had prepared. And what they had done is simply copied Leon Lewis's list verbatim, but instead of calling it A, B, and C, it was dangerous, highly dangerous, dangerous, and keep under surveillance. And the FBI and local police simply went through Leon Lewis's list and arrested everyone in order. So by December 8th, the Nazi threat seemed to be over. Except Leon Lewis never trusted anyone, and he kept his surveillance operation going until 1945. And again, it's a good thing he did, because even in the war years, he uncovered plots to assassinate Jews in Los Angeles. But Leon Lewis would die of a heart attack while driving on the Pacific Coast Highway in the early 1950s, and he would die an unsung hero. The only recognition he ever received was the Americanism Award from the American Legion in June 1939. But the last thing Lewis understood was that, in a sense, what is the take home here? What can we understand from what Lewis understood? And what Lewis understood was that as an American, it was his obligation to stand up against hate. And he recruited all these men to help them. And virtually every one of his recruits was a Christian. Just about in fact, every spy who went undercover for more than a meeting was a Christian. But not one of them felt they were working for the Jews. Even though they knew Lewis was Jewish, they knew what was going on, they felt they were working for America. Because they all said that in America, when one group tries to turn another group of Americans against each other because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity, it was the job of every American to stand up and stop that from happening. And in Leon Lewis's last memo before he resigned his position at the very end of the war, he said, only in a truly diverse and accepting America can we achieve the true realization of the American dream. Thank you. Let me go back to the Zoom. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're still there. And I think, all right, if everyone wants to unmute, we can give you a standing O.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I got one problem here, and maybe you all can help. Somehow I'm out of the Zoom. I'm trying to launch the meeting. I don't see anybody.
Here,
Yeah, it's,
My wife will take care of that.
Oh, maybe I need to just stop the share. Oh, there we go. Okay.
No,
All right, I think that now everybody can see why we selected this program as our second expanded program. And this is absolutely sensational work, Steve. Truly a landmark piece of journalism. And so, we really salute you. And since you're not being paid for this appearance, we will encourage everybody on this program to go out and buy this book if you haven't done that already. It is a sensational piece of work. I will say that Steve was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was asked to persuade someone to read this book in 50 words or less, and he was able to do it in 49 words. And that he says that it offers important lessons for today. Leon Lewis and his spies defeated a variety of enemies bent on violence and murder. They showed us that when a government fails to combat extremists, democracy demands that every citizen protect the lives of every American, no matter their race or religion. So kudos to you, Steve. And I want to start the questioning, and we will open it up for questioning as long as folks are available to ask questions. I would like to know, first and foremost, can you tell us a little bit about your parents, and how has being a child of survivors informed your work and your career?
Well, let's see, my mother was born in a small town outside Lodz, Szydłowska, and they eventually moved to Lodz. And she was there until the Lodz ghetto fell. And then she was sent to Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, from Bergen-Belsen to a munitions camp in Salzwedel, Germany, where she was liberated and then made her way to Munich. And I imagine in a group of survivors, second generation, you all know that Munich was the central depot for information after the war. Everyone made their way to Munich to find out. It was like the Facebook of its time. People would post, there were huge billboards of the name of towns, and people would post a note if they knew somebody had survived from that town. Well, my mother went there to see what, her family had survived. My father grew up in Warsaw, and he was in the Warsaw ghetto until that fell. And when it did fall, he and his father were sent to Dachau. And he spent the war in Dachau, where he learned to be a baker. That's how he survived. And after the war, he remained a baker. And I will say, no one will ever know my father's name, but those of you who have spent time in New York, if you've shopped at Zabar's or Balducci's for over 30 years, their Russian coffee cake, their apple strudel and cheese strudel all came from my father's bakery in Queens. They met after the war in Munich. Like many, wanted to fell in love, got married, came to New York, started bakeries, and I grew up in New York and Queens. I went to Columbia. And, I grew up as a second generation, which is, to me, that was the norm, because everyone around us we lived in a shtetl in Queens. Everybody, my parents' friends, almost all of them were survivors. So all the kids I grew up with were the kids of survivors. And the irony for me is I did everything but Jewish history until I started working on this book in around 2014. No, probably 2013. I started working on this book. And it was the first time I thought, I'm turning to my own history and turning to Jewish history. And I found an area that it's very personal. That's what I can say. And I'm continuing to write about fascists in America.
So
And
that was going to be my follow-up question, Steve, is can you share with us a little bit about your current work and your current projects?
yeah, I'm writing a book now called The Secret War Against Hate, American Resistance to White Supremacy after 1945. And in a sense, I so many stories stop in Pearl Harbor and get into this, what I'd call the Kumbaya myth, that, we're bombed by Japan and Americans immediately realize the threat that Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo pose to the nation. They go, they fight, they come back, and they realize that after all these years of totalitarianism, we need to have a more tolerant nation. We need to have the kind of salad bow nation. And we need to have a nation that Tom Brokaw would later memorialize as the greatest generation in the good war. And what I discovered is that's only half the truth. And that the only way we can understand January 6th is to understand that fascism and Nazism never died. It remained vibrant. During the war years, LA Times would print Sunday morning what sermons were being preached that day. And one Sunday, I see a sermon being preached, "Shall we kill the Jew?" "Shall we kill the Jew?" advertised as a sermon. Well, what I discovered is that the undercover operation Leon Lewis was running was not the only one. And in fact, after the war, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and a group called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League all ran spy operations, spying on fascists, spying on the Ku Klux Klan, spying on fascist groups, spying on Nazi groups, spying on white supremacists. And so the book I'm writing now follows 4 of the godfathers of white supremacy. Only one name I think will people in the audience know, Emory Burke, Jesse B. Stoner, James Maydall, and the one name you all may know, George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party. They are 4 men who work together. It's not just 4 isolated leaders. Even though many of them hate each other, they work together for 30, 40 years trying to create a fascist America. And so the book I'm writing talks about what they're doing, their vision, how they're trying to organize people, and at the same time, how the spies are uncovering this and in some cases, foiling their efforts at murder and sabotage.
Thanks. I want to open it up to others who might have some questions, please. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, Steve, this is David Byloon. How did you come across him and decide and look into his workings and everything? And what led you to that?
Dumb luck. I'd like to claim it was my genius. But in fact, I was writing the book before this was called Hollywood Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics. And it's 9 movie stars and Louis B. Mayer, 5 on the left, 5 on the right. And while I was writing about Edward G. Robinson, who was one of the leading political activists in Hollywood during the 1930s, I got very interested in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, a group that had formed in 1936 with the idea that if you had movie stars in these protests, they held many demonstrations and they would always put the most famous movie stars at the front of the line holding their banner, with the idea that reporters are going to take pictures of these movie stars and those pictures will be on the front page of newspapers everywhere throughout the world. And that'll give more and more publicity to the anti-Nazi, anti-fascist cause. Well, I was interested in learning more about what went on with the Anti-Nazi League. And so I went online and I was Googling Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, and I found a website linked to the Oviatt Library at Cal State Northridge. They had done an exhibit special exhibit called In Our Own Backyard, Nazis and Fascists in Los Angeles, 1930s and 40s. And I looked through it and I knew nothing of, this is a history I knew nothing about. I'd been writing about Hollywood for 20 years, but I knew nothing about this history. So I went to Cal State Northridge, and the collection has almost 400 boxes. And for the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, there were probably 10 boxes. And this is going to be a paragraph in my book. And I'm a slow writer. And I thought, I don't have the time to go through 10 boxes for one paragraph. But I said, when I'm done with this book, I'm going to see what's here, because this seems intriguing. And when I finished it, I in fact went back and started going through the files, but they were all a mystery to me. I couldn't figure out for, easily a month. I couldn't figure out what was going on, because what I didn't know at the time that the Nazis knew about Leon Lewis, and Lewis knew that the Nazis knew about him. He ran his spy operation from his law office on 6th Street downtown in the Roosevelt building. And he was afraid that because the Nazis knew him and knew where he was, they would break into his office, get his files, and they'd know who his undercover agents were and either beat them to death or kill them, because they had sworn that if we find out that there are spies in our midst, if we find out a spy is working for the government, we will just beat them severely, because they are being patriotic, they're working for their government. But if we find Jews who are spying, we're going to kill them. And so every spy had a number, but there was no master index. And I couldn't figure out who was spying on what, who was what. And then one of my friends, who's the archivist of university archivist at USC, said, Joe Roos, who I think was involved with Leon Lewis, has his papers at USC. And he has an autobiography. So I went to Special Collections, took a look at the autobiography, and after reading 30 pages, I literally jumped out of my seat, went out of the library because I didn't want to disturb anyone, and called my wife and said, I got a book, I know what's going on. Joe Roos has just explained now I know how all this fits in. And I eventually found the master code for all the spies, and I was able to put together the story. But trust me, there is far more of this story that I have not told than I did tell in the book. And I wish I had more students who were interested in fascism and Nazism, because there are a few more dissertations to be written out of what's in that collection.
Yes, Phyllis.
Thank you so much. This was really fabulous. I mean, the kind of research that goes into this is the history we don't learn that you've dug up. I'm wondering if I heard a podcast recently where Rachel Maddow, it's called Ultra, and some of the things that you alluded to, she mentions in this. It's about Nazi infiltration in the government.
If you listen to episode 3, it's all me and Hitler in LA. I've been working with Rachel on this.
It sounded so familiar. While you were talking, I thought, I've heard part of this before. Yes, absolutely. And it's amazing. It just reminds me again of the history that will, that unless we listen to or read your book or listen to someone like you, would never know this. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would recommend for all of you who have not tuned into this, if you just Google Rachel Maddow Ultra, it's 8-part series, and it's incredibly well made.
And it's free.
Fascism and Nazism in America in the 30s and 40s. Yes, it's free.
Anybody else have a question for our esteemed guest?
Allegedly esteemed.
Well, okay. Thank you all for coming. Those of you who are not already members of Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Survivors, just contact me if you'd like to join. Steve, can't thank you enough. The book is absolutely sensational and so terribly, sadly relevant today. So we thank you for your work. I will make sure that everyone has bought this book, and all of us will be following your career and buying all of your other books. And we are greatly indebted to you for taking the time
Mhm.
to be with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank
My
you.
It's
pleasure.
amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all tuning in. I just think
Thank
this
you
is
very
such
much.
an
Thank you.
important story to
Wonderful.
know.
Jeez.
So,
Thank you.
have a good Sunday,
I
everyone.
hope there's a lot of Lewises out there now.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Let's hope.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David, for organizing.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.